Hi, welcome back. Okay, this is getting exciting now. We're going to talk about how to go from this little tube of pigment to something beautiful on our paper. Let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to take my ceramic white plate from the thrift store, and I'm going to use some ultramarine blue from Da Vinci Watercolor Company, but you can use whatever you have. I think blue might be a good color for us to start with because you can really see what is happening to the pigment on the paper. I'm going to just squirt out a little bit of that pigment, just like I'm putting toothpaste onto my brush. I'm going to recap it. That way we don't waste any of that precious paint, baby. I'm going to get my flat 1-inch brush wet in my water bucket. I tap the bristles onto the bottom of the bucket and kind of gently make a tapping rhythm, make sure all the old pigment's out of those bristles. And then I'm going to just touch the corner of my brush into that little squirted out pile of pigment. And it'll immediately start running down into the plate, to the flat section of the plate. I'm going to keep going back up with the tip of my brush, touch the corner of that pigment so that I can get a thicker mixture. I'd like it to be thicker than water, like about the consistency of melted butter. I'm going back and forth, and I'm taking a look so that there is no pigment that's sort of like jammed up in my bristles that's undissolved. I want all of it dissolved. I want it to be smooth and creamy. There we go. That looks pretty smooth and creamy. I've gone back and forth and really mixed it. This is what I call a loaded brush now. It has a lot of pigment in it and quite a bit of water. The water is the agent that sort of like spreads that pigment smoothly onto our paper. I'm using newsprint for these first demonstrations, and that's because it's really inexpensive, but it also kind of shows you and lets your eyes learn what happens on the paper with a loaded brush, with that water and pigment mixture. So when I pull that 1-inch flat brush straight across my paper, I get about a 1-inch thick stripe or line or rectangular shape. Quite a bit of pigment in there. It's pretty blue. I can see a darker blue over on the place where I started and lighter where I ended up. I'm going to go back and reload. Go back to my puddle, and I'm going to maybe get a little bit more pigment in there, but back and forth, nice and creamy. And then I'm going to do it again, make another stroke. This time I'm going to keep on going. I'm going to keep going until a lot of that pigment has come out. I'm getting lighter shapes now, lighter rectangles. And if I take a paper towel, let's grab some paper towels here, and tear off a sheet of that and fold up a little paper towel pad and set the brush right onto the paper towel, right where the ferrule, the metal part, reaches the bristles, right where it is crimped against those bristles. I'm going to hold that paper towel there and suck up some of that water, a little bit of the pigment too, I can see. But now this is preparing it for what we call a dry brush. This means that the pigment is still in those bristles, but there's not as much water behind it to spread it all over your paper. If I draw across the newsprint now, you can actually see individual bristle strokes, little lines in that shape. And this is how I can get some pretty intriguing textures later on. We'll be using better paper for that and kind of get a better sense of it later, but this really lets your eye see what's actually happening. It's fairly dry, and some of that pigment from individual bristles is creating a little scraped pattern of texture. Let's see what else we can do with this flat 1-inch brush. I'm going to rinse it out and go back over to my puddle. Maybe load up a little bit more pigment. The great thing about a flat brush is that you can paint in two different directions. I can do a thick stroke using all the 1-inch width of the brush, or if I turn it edgewise, I can get a thin stroke, almost like a line, and it actually makes a pretty consistent line. That's because you've got a whole army of bristles lined up to help spread some pigment onto that paper, and I love that line. It's a nice strong one, a firm one. I can do some cross-hatching with that. It creates an interesting pattern, but a pretty strong, even, smooth line. If I reload now and try both at the same time, I'm going to go flat and then gradually turn my brush until I reach that point. I could sort of waver this. I can make it wide and thin, and that could create some interesting patterns. Flat brushes, although they're usually not quite as wide as this, flat brushes is what the old-time sign painters used to use, and now graphic artists a lot of times use in order to get lettering, because you can create thin strokes or curved strokes, and it can kind of make some interesting and beautiful lettering kind of possibilities. If you hold the brush in one position, you can get an interesting thick and thin kind of rhythm to it. Before we leave the flat 1-inch brush, one of my favorite brushes, it's really a very versatile brush. I've painted some paintings where this is the only brush I used to create the entire painting. I'm going to go back and reload it and just show you a couple of other things that I think are pretty interesting for this kind of a shape of bristles. For an example, we already made some rectangles, but if I just pull it about an inch, I make basically a square. And so that can lead to quite a few design ideas. It can help me if I'm painting a structure, if I'm painting a house or a barn or a factory. This might be a brush that would help me create that rectilinear shape. I'm going to try to hold my brush now at sort of a 45-degree angle and draw a trapezoid shape, a slanted shape, which is actually, I double that up a little bit, it's actually a roof of a structure. If I put another indication of the roof on the back side, I can use this rectangle brush shape to create a whole building. Again, it's the fact that it's flat, it fills in quite a bit of area at one time. It's going to allow you to do some bigger things without being too fussy with little tiny strokes. If I really thought ahead about that, I probably could have done that with 3 strokes of my brush. So I'm going to encourage you to keep practicing with this flat 1-inch brush and some newsprint and see what things you can do with it. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to show you one thing that I find super useful with this brush. It's great for creating unexpected and kind of spontaneous, strong designs, particularly in the foreground of a landscape painting. And that's because there is so much pigment inside this brush at one time. You can spread it across a whole sheet of paper and you still get a very strong statement of color. So I'm going to take this now, load it up, and just pull it across. And let's just take a look at what happened. I've got some stronger pigment at the top where the bristles just sort of brushed edgewise. It's a little bit lighter. Over here I can see some dry brush. It looks like it started to dry out before it got to the end and left a nice texture there. And it's got some thicker paint right at the end here and some sort of a nice shape. I'm going to do that again and just spray it, play with it, be a little bit spontaneous and goofy with it, and just see what you can create with those kind of shapes using the side edge and a quick movement of your arm, and just see what you can come up with. You're going to find that once you've played around with that 1-inch flat, that this one is very, very similar. You can do many of the same things. In some ways, you can handle this one a little bit easier. So you'll be able to do things with what will feel, I think, to you like a little bit more control. I could make a brick wall, and I have control of where I'm making that brick shape. Those bristles are so tight and nice and firm, it really feels like a brush that I have a lot of control of. If I don't want to make that wide stroke, remember, just like with the flat 1-inch brush, we can go sideways and it makes a really nice line. It's pretty dark, pretty full. You've got all these bristles lined up to help get that paint distributed nice and smoothly and evenly. That same shape, if I hold it at an angle, just like we did with our 1-inch brush, you could make that rooftop. If I hold it straight, it makes that nice flat wash, straight line. I'm going to just put my little roof angle on there for fun. And now, even just with one little stroke of this brush, I could make my little doorway. That's the 1/2-inch flat. I'm still going to be using blue, and ultramarine blue in this case, so that we can practice. This is a number 10 round. That means that the ferrule is round, and when they crimped the bristles, they crimped them in a barrel shape so that they all come out round, and it comes to a point. The wonderful thing about round brushes is that you have a little bit more control. You can do a little bit tighter detail than you can with that 1-inch flat brush that we've been playing around with. So let's see what we can do with this one. This round number 10, I'm going to load up with some of that blue pigment, and I'm doing the same process. I touch my little squirted out pigment, and I'm taking it down to the flat part of my palette and creating a puddle. I want that puddle to be creamy, melted butter consistency. Okay, there's a loaded round brush. A lot of pigment inside those bristles. So when I pull it across, I get a nice line, this time a little thicker than the sideways version of that flat 1-inch brush. It's maybe 1/4 of an inch thick. If I try to draw with the very tip, or paint, I should say, with the very tip of this brush, I can get a thinner line. It requires the pressure to stay even, and that's why this is maybe not as consistent of a line as I could enjoy when I used this flat 1-inch brush. Remember, pulling this one sideways, I could get a pretty consistent line, not too shaky or wobbly. This one is different because the pressure you're putting on it is what's going to determine the thickness. So the great thing of that is if you want to have a line that varies, you can push, let up, push, let up, push, let up, and push, and I could create a pattern, almost a wave-like pattern. If I push opposite this time, push where I had lifted last one, I could get almost a wave pattern. So this brush is very helpful in that way. It's a great brush to use if you already know what shape you want and you want to fill it in. So if I know that I have a leaf shape and I want to paint that leaf a solid color, I could fill in with this round brush. The other thing I find really helpful with a number 10 or number 12 or number 8 round brush is that I can create some interesting textures, almost like grass, if I put that flat onto the paper. Now my brush is completely flat. The handle is actually touching the paper. I'm going to angle it down a little bit so that the bristles are the part that's in contact with my newsprint and push upward. All I did was I set it down, bristles are touching the newsprint, and I push it to the top of my paper. I just pushed. Let's take a look at what we got. What I love about this is this unpredictable kind of textury, dry brush, kind of grassy looking stuff that I got here. And that's why I love this brush. But it's also very easy to control. Again, I could go back over my leaf and show you even the veins of it. That kind of like stays within the lines, if you want to, so to speak. Gives you a good sense of control. So now we'll try painting with a rigger. I think that rigger gets its name from the rigging on a ship. Maybe early artists that did ships found that this thin brush, it's a very thin round brush where the bristles are long and sort of springy. And it allows you to paint line work or even like a rope on a ship, just using this very thin, long, springy, round brush. If I pull this across, I just get a pretty nice consistent line. I can hold it more almost like a pencil so that those of you that are practiced at drawing using pencils and graphite tools to draw with are going to find some comfort with this because this is almost like drawing with a pencil. So take your rigger and load it up. I'm going to go to my puddle, touch my blue pigment, knock it on the edge of my palette a little bit so it doesn't just drip like you can see that I already have done. And just practice some strokes with it. See if you can write your name with this. One of the things that I feel like is a major way that I use the rigger is for things in nature that are thin, like branches and twigs and grass. It becomes a really helpful tool to creating part of your landscape. Let's try that. I'm going to draw a branch going up and splitting off. I'm going to have a tree limb or a branch that has a junction in it. The rigger is pretty easy to help make that. I'm going to just I pull it away from my body, pull it away from my body, pull it away from my body. One of the things that you notice that happened right here is I let up the pressure on my rigger so that it got thinner and thinner till it almost fades into nothingness. And that's one of the joys of this rigger, and it's one of the things that allows me to paint things like grass, for example. If I start down at the ground and I let the rigger just fly up, I pull up towards the top of my paper, but let's look at those strokes. Each stroke is actually tapering off and coming to a fine point. That's what gives you some beautiful grass-like effects. And so this rigger is going to become a really important tool in our arsenal here as we work on creating a landscape. I can branch some of that grass off. I can put little leaves coming off of it or put a little cattail on the end of it. This is a tool that's you're going to find extremely helpful. Okay, I'm going to put a little bit more ultramarine blue on the edge of my white plate. Let's try some fan brushes. They come in all different sizes. I hope you'll have a chance to just experiment with these because they take a little bit of getting used to. They can be a brush that really provides sort of a shortcut because in a way, this is now almost like having 10 riggers that are all just lined up in a sort of a curved shape that would allow you to make the kind of branches of a shrub or some sagebrush out in the desert. As you get used to it, you'll realize that this is an important brush to practice on the side with before you hit your final piece of paper with it, to kind of make sure that you've got the bristles the way that you want it. I'm going to use a smaller one that's easier for me to squish the ferrule. I squish that with my hand and get those bristles to kind of spread farther apart and create that sagebrush look. If I go the other direction from the ground up, just the way that the plants grow, I can get a pretty nice clump of grass using a fan brush. So I start down at the ground, and just like the grass grows, I pull it up. Let me do just one stroke and take a look at it. This is where I set my fan down, right at the ground level, and I pulled it up, and as I pulled, I probably released the pressure a little bit so that you can see wispy little fine lines on the ends of the grass. I probably would go back in a painting and hit that at a different angle so that you would see a clump of grass. And there's a lot of pigment towards the center, darker area, and then less pigment and nice thin sort of filaments of grass moving out away from it. So the fan is a very useful brush for landscape painting, but again, it takes a little more practice, and especially do some practice on newsprint. Do some practice that you don't care about on cheap paper on the side so that you can, when you start to go into your painting, you feel like you know what you're doing, that you've got some confidence. Up, up, up. Wispy, nice and dark. That's the fan. Okay, well, our fifth and final brush is one of my favorites, the toothbrush. Yay. And the great thing about this is if your dentist is a nice dentist like mine, you get a free one every time you get a checkup. So you get a pretty good collection by the time you're my age. This is a tool that adds a really interesting and fun spark to your paintings. You're going to be practicing on some newsprint, so there's no big consequences if you mess up, because this is a little bit more unpredictable. Let's put it that way. I'm going to get my bristles of my old beat up free toothbrush in the water, stir it around, kind of loosen up those bristles a little bit with my thumb. And now I'm going to go over to my puddle. I'm going to, in the same way, you could go back and get a little more pigment. I'm still using ultramarine. I'm still using melted butter consistency and stirring that toothbrush around. Let's take a look at it. I've got a lot of pigment in the front end of these bristles, not so much maybe at the back. If I hold this toothbrush in my hand like this, I can pull back my finger. See if you can get your toothbrush into this kind of a position where you've got the handle kind of running back towards your palm of your hand. Your index finger is able to touch the tip of the bristles of the toothbrush, and you can pull it back. When you do that, you're going to fire off some little pigment blobs. You're going to have a splatter hit your paper. That's one way of using a toothbrush. It creates a fairly fine dot of pigment on your paper. But now you can see why I want to use newsprint and practice this a bunch of times before you put it onto a painting. Typically, I use the toothbrush towards the end of a painting, and so you run that risk of working for a whole day on some beautiful masterpiece and wrecking it in 10 seconds of using your toothbrush. It's a word to the wise. Use newsprint. Yay! Practice it a lot. Okay, I'm going to go back and get more pigment into this toothbrush, and this time I'm going to show you the way I really use the most often. It's a loaded up toothbrush. It's got a lot of pigment in these bristles. I'm going to take my non-dominant hand, which is my left, and hold out my index finger as a little bar above my painting. And now in my right hand, I'm going to take my toothbrush and just knock it on my finger. And that is going to drop some drops of pigment onto my paper. Depending on how thick the pigment is, that means whether you had super creamy, thick stuff, or maybe more watery, thin stuff, you'll get bigger or smaller blobs. What I like to do is knock my first finger load over my palette. That gets rid of the biggest amount, the unpredictable big blob. That's my big blob theory right there. That first one is just too unpredictable. I don't like that. But then my second one or third one, when I put it over the paper, I have a little more control. And that's what I want. I want larger and some medium-sized spots of pigment. And that can become the sand on a beach or the stars in the sky or the little blossoms on the edge of a weed in the edge of the desert. Take some more newsprint and try this again. Knocking it over your finger or pulling it so that you create a finer misty splatter. This is going to be a really important trick to have up your sleeve when you get towards finishing off a painting with a flourish, with a little bit of a flare. Okay, play around with these brushes. Use newsprint, watch closely what happens. Practice mixing together that melted butter puddle. See how much pigment it takes to make a nice mark. Notice how the water flows out of the bristles. Once you've practiced those strokes, we're ready to go on to some of the real building blocks of creating a watercolor painting. Hi, I'm Bob. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you'll go by my website at watercolorwithbob.com. That's where you'll find an interactive outline of the whole course. You can also share your work with me and your fellow students. One thing I really love about watercolor is how accessible it is. That's why I realized it was important to me to put this course out for free. That said, it would mean the world to me if you would support this work. You can like it, you could share it with your friends, you could subscribe to the channel, you could also visit the gift shop or even make a donation. Thanks so much. See you on the next lesson, and happy painting. If we finish this painting, can we finally go have a coffee break?